I'm Deirdre Howard-Wagner. I'm from the Australian National University. I am in Pollen, a centre created by Bronwyn Parry, who used to be here at LSE, and I'm the program lead for social policy participation and inclusion. I'm also the research program lead or research director of policy as well. And I'm going to be presenting on a case study of Canberra, where I grew up and now live, lived for 20 years, and looking at doing a comparative social policy approach to social housing in Canberra. And I'm going to weave a bit of a story through this process of my presentation. So what I'm interested in particularly is the transformation in social policy in Canberra. So having grown up in Canberra, where it's a planned city, it's a public service city, the capital, and it was a universal public good. So I was the daughter of a public servant. When I was young, we had a government house. It wasn't a public housing, a social housing house. We were able to get a government loan, and that was part of the idea that everyone could have access to government housing in Canberra. And it's through my work in Indigenous policy and Indigenous housing that I became interested in what the shift in policy in housing from a universal public good to a residual safety net, and looking at this, how this shift reflects, because I look at neoliberalism a lot in my work, if anyone's had any look at my work, reflects the principles of neoliberal governance, but trying to dig a bit deeper than just sort of attributing this variegated neoliberalism, but also looking at underlying state practices and how those practices manage populations, discipline urban spaces, and legitimise inequality. So one of the other areas I'm interested in is disadvantage inequality. So bringing these elements together in this work. So I also was interested in sort of thinking, well, as a social policy scholar, I'm interested in comparative social policy. So by looking at initially thinking, well, I think London has a lot of similarities to what's happened in Canberra, but then also I thought, oh, well, Paris looks like a really good model. I wanted to dig deeper into what was happening in Paris, and then also compare to Vienna to see if I could find some social policy solutions. So in comparison, Canberra's trajectory mirrors London's, and I will come into this context of residualisation, but it's not the primary focus of my work, so I'm not a scholar of residualisation. And then also the tenant stigmatisation that's occurred in Canberra as well. And so what I found was that it very much diverges from the Paris universalist approach, yet dispersive approach, and starkly contrasts the Vienna approach of strong commitment to housing as a university. So where did I start? My starting point, which is an interesting point to weave in. I've been looking at urban Indigenous disadvantage. And so this is where I come from at housing. I don't come from a housing policy scholar. And I come at looking at the issue of how, the function of community and community-controlled organisations and co-location in supporting positive outcomes in overcoming Indigenous disadvantage. So in Australia, the key national policy or national Indigenous social policy is closing the gap between Indigenous disadvantage and non-Indigenous disadvantage. So one of the things that I was looking at was how is we overcoming Indigenous disadvantage in urban contexts, and then really the function of community and community-controlled organisations and co-location being really central to that. And I wrote a book on invisibility in the city, and that book looks at the function of these organisations and community and co-location. And really housing and the co-location of housing to infrastructure is really central to that overcoming Indigenous disadvantage. So I focus on cities like Newcastle, Sydney, Vancouver, Toronto, and San Francisco Bay and Chicago. And so I look at how that important function. So that's sort of my grounding here to this presentation of what I'm looking at. And so in Canberra's earlier model, Aboriginal social housing tenants were housed in suburbs close to community-controlled organisations, good schools, public transport and employment opportunities. And we have a prison in Canberra, and it was also close to the proximity to the prison system. So, and we have a high population of Aboriginal Canberra as well. So it was all about, you know, proximity and co-location. And so in the suburb that I live in, Narrabundah is one of the key suburbs that's housed Aboriginal community, and it's got the Aboriginal Health Service as well there. Yet with the process of gentrification and shifting housing policy, Aboriginal tenants have been increasingly moved out of these inner city suburbs and relocated to Canberra's outer suburbs. And this had a huge impact on Aboriginal disadvantage in urban contexts. And so there's weaker service provision, they're in poor performing school areas and fewer opportunities, and it's creating new pockets of disadvantage and escalating social problems. We're seeing, I was noticing this as an issue in Canberra more generally. So now, I mean, Canberra's always been considered to have good schools, full stop, and some schools are better than others. So where I live in Narrabundah is one of the top schools. So people are now trying to push into the Narrabundah market and pushing social housing out of that market, and you're doing a lot of selling off of social housing, but I'll get into that in a bit more. And so what's happening now is there's becoming schools that are problematic, areas of crime, so typical sociological change that we're observing in Canberra. So I observed that this mirrors the broader residualisation of not only Aboriginal housing provision, but also Indigenous specific government service, where there's this chronic underfunding and policy shifts that have left Aboriginal people more vulnerable to cycles of exclusion and poverty. Now it's not going to work. Okay. So I was interested in the intersection between residualisation with Indigenous policy marginalisation. I'm not going to go into it, sort of skim over it. It'll be there to read later. And then I was also interested in thinking about this idea, because I've been thinking about Indigenous disadvantage in the city, and then the idea of tonkus in cities by design and housing as designed inequality. So that sort of drew me down another pathway, and thinking about Canberra, London and Paris and the design of housing policy, you know, and the shifts in housing policy design. And then city governments as designers of social futures, which is another argument of tonkus. And then applied to my cases and how Vienna could be used to design and sustain social housing as a civic good, whereas Canberra and London have redesigned housing as a residual safety net, with Paris deploying design of logics and dispersion and control. I come back to all of this, but it's also this idea of cities by design is one of the themes within this paper that I'm developing. So, and the other work of Fran Tonkus' work is around urban inequalities, which resonates strongly with my own work, just in the idea of city government and urban inequalities, and that idea of, you know, her framework makes clear that housing and planning represent one of the most powerful arenas through which cities can address inequality. So my paper will speak directly to the second of these domains, is housing and planning, and it'll show how Canberra's trajectory away from that universalist, government-led provision toward residualisation has amplified. So I am also drawing on Anna Pagani and colleagues' mapping of systemic issues in London's social housing sector, and both our accounts highlight how residualisation is the outcome of interlocking pressures rather than isolated policy failures, the shrinking stocks, increasing restrictive eligibility and displacement justified through narratives of financial necessity or estate failure. So in Canberra, it's been about this financial necessity, and it's very much this focus on this disintegrating social housing stock that cannot be repaired. And so the idea is of relocation to this newer sort of social housing, but that is also in the outer suburbs of Canberra. So while their London study uses systems thinking, mine uses very much that sort of broader sociological lens. And I'm very much interested in how state practices manage populations and the disciplining of urban spaces and legitimising inequality underpin this process of individualisation as well. And so these two perspectives underscore the erosion of social housing, not merely as a technical problem of supply or funding, but a systemic process that reorders urban space, fragments communities and deepens socio-spatial inequality. So the argument that I'm advancing is more broadly, it's not a new argument in the idea that response to inequality is a producer of it, housing as a response, but it's more, and this is the idea that that housing regimes actively structure stratification, but that I'm looking at how residualisation, relocation and redevelopment are not neutral reforms but state practices of managing. So it's that broader analysis beyond just residualisation. So there's deeply political elements as well. So I've just, for anyone's interested who doesn't know what residualisation is, that's sort of some of the key works on residualisation. In terms of the housing sector, it really manifests as a shrinking public housing stock, stricter eligibility criteria, and a concentration of disadvantaged and spatially segregated areas. So now I want to just explain how that's happened in Canberra. So I'm not going to leave that one there. So what I wanted to do was, I really was looking for, as I started, was to look at comparative social policy insights across 4 cities. And so for me, by doing that comparison, residualisation is not only a neoliberal governance logic, but it's also that deeper state practices, which I just mentioned, of population management, spatial reduction, regulation and social control. And I think that Canberra and London are there's a lot of parallels around that market pragmatism, urban discipline, the fragmenting of communities and the concentration of disadvantage. I found really interesting because I thought Paris might be a really sort of innovative case study that I'd be looking at. But then I found that Paris was very ideologically driven approach, and it's driven by this universalism that can achieve just similar dispersal effects under the guise of social mix. And I'll come back to that point later. And then I thought Vienna would show that the state can organise housing inclusively and sustain cohesion and reduce inequality, but then started to dig deep into that case study as well. And that also has its limitations. So my comparative analysis reveals that social consequences of housing policy fragmentation and displacement and marginalisation are shaped by state-mediated spatial and population strategies as by economic or ideological imperatives, highlighting the dual mechanisms underlying residualisation. So I want to go into a bit more interesting stuff that you probably haven't heard before, because you might probably know about London, Paris and Vienna, but you don't know about Canberra. So I think it's an interesting case study. So Canberra provides a distinctive case study because in Australian social policy, housing policy, it stands in sharp contrast to Vienna's enduring universalist model, and it started as a universalist model. It was originally conceived as a planned city. Walter Burley Griffin sort of won the award to design Canberra, and our housing system from the 1950s to the 1980s reflected this ethos. And, you know, there were, you know, diverse income groups were into these cohesive communities. And around 70% at its peak, 70% of households benefit from public housing with subsidised loans. So I had my first loan was a housing loan, even though I was a public servant at the time. But my first loan was a government housing loan because I was under a certain income. So there were certain benefits of growing up in Canberra and living in what was called government housing, and also the access to housing loans, which sort of this universalist model. And the interesting thing is, coming back to Canberra after leaving for 20 years, I now live in Narrabundah, and what is a former government house. It's a beautifully architecturally designed house that was built for government employees. But my street is a pepper potted street. And when I first came back, my next door neighbour was a Maori woman. Across the road was an Aboriginal family. You know, so there was a pepper potting of social housing. So every second house was a social housing house. And what I've watched over the last 8 years is an extensive knockdown and rebuild effort and relocation of a lot of my former neighbours to the outer suburbs of Canberra, which sort of drew my attention alongside with Indigenous disadvantage to what was happening. So, you know, since the 1980s, we had sort of this neoliberal reform. and local development pressures that have transformed social housing into this residual safety net. And so you're getting this intensifying spatial inequality, social stigmatisation as well. And what we've seen, though, more recently is this selling off of public housing stock and reducing this new supply. So it's even more and more tightening and increasing homelessness as well, and increasing waiting lists as well. So really long waiting lists in Canberra. So the eligibility criteria, the lowering benefits level, and the stigma around welfare relief. And also alongside this, with changes in Australia, is this idea, but you're really seeing it in Canberra as well, is this two-tiered system in education as well. So when I grew up, every school was the same effectively. It wasn't a sort of stratified system in Canberra, whereas today you're buying into particular suburbs to go to particular schools. The higher rate of, so the grammar school's just down the road from me. Most of the kids that are going to my daughter's primary school will not be going to the public system, they'll be going to the grammar system. So this is, and the health system, you've got private hospitals now, but when you only had public hospitals. So this whole sort of transformation of Canberra and this sort of neoliberal reform sort of approach. So you've got, you know, in the 21st century, so you've got this, and here I've got, down here is my home, which is a lovely butterfly designed government house. And then that's up there is another government house there. They're not social housing, they're government housing. But these did become sort of public social housing houses. And now, so the houses now are no longer, they're being knocked down. So the house here would have been knocked down and rebuilt. And even homes like mine are being knocked down and rebuilt and I'll show you some images in a minute. So you're seeing, you know, these big consequences and displacements of tenants. So one of the things that Canberra also had was this very much inner city dwelling. So this, multi-unit dwellings and houses in the inner city, which are no longer there. And I'll come back to this in a second. And the key policy has been this growing and renewing housing program in the ACT, and that's the Australian Capital Territory. So we're a territory within the federal system, so which is a really unique sort of model in the sense that our local government is also our territory government in the federal system. So which makes us a really interesting microcosm in policy context. So over an 8-year span, they were going to invest with a budget of 867 million, which sounds really good. They were going to renew and grow public housing in Canberra. But what happened was that this effort of growing and renewing program was really about redevelopment and the redevelopment of areas like we've got this main road that comes in through Canberra called North Bond Avenue. And so there was the redevelopment of the North Bond Avenue corridor, which symbolised this broader transformation. So public housing complexes along there were demolished and replaced with private mixed tenure development. And then, but the former tenants weren't returned to that site. So 1,288 tenants from 13 multi-unit public housing properties were relocated, which is quite a large number of people to be relocated. And then in these tenants weren't voluntarily relocated, so over time. And so what happened was there was this mandated displacement, which was highly contentious in Canberra. And although some people accepted relocations, others didn't. So some people would have been there for 30 or 40 years and families had grown up in these properties. So in 2023, there was a class action lawsuit lodged in the Federal Court of Australia. And then initially it was framed as a breach of the ACT Human Rights Act, and the case later shifted its legal focus to the breach of contract and unconscionable conduct under Australian consumer law. And what happened was that they could not, as a result, they overturned this idea of forced mandatory relocation. And so, which had a big change in shift for some people being able to stay in place. And so many people reported, and there's a lot of narratives around this, that they were moving away from essential services, public transport, employment, schools and community networks, which I've already mentioned. And many were long-term tenants who got these termination notices despite having lived in it. Okay. And critics argue that the process offered minimal choice and failed to uphold procedural fairness, particularly for vulnerable groups such as the elderly, people with disabilities and Aboriginal tenants who, when you think about being moved out to the outer suburbs with poor public transport, etc., also had impacts. So that was what I was particularly interested in what's happening here. So this is these weren't these multi-storey social housing units. These were just small scale units that were demolished. And this is larger units have actually been replacing those. But as you can see, the contrast between what's been replaced the social housing units on Northbourne Avenue in the redevelopment. And then here, so in Narrabundah, there was some flats, there was pepper potting. And so what is down the bottom is the flats that were replaced. And as you can see, and this house was replaced with this house. So you've got this architecturally designed, beautiful homes popping up left, right and centre. And my daughter said, as we drive along, she goes, oh no, Mum, there's another knockdown and rebuild, because I'm always criticising the process of knockdown and rebuilding. So, so there's been sort of replacement of, social housing and the gentrification out. And so even in Red Hill, so these were sort of social housing units in Red Hill, not large scale, just sort of small scale units, weren't known as pockets of crime or anything, just, mixed tenants. But then it's been replaced with this sort of architecturally designed units and then these sort of townhouses as well. So the critical points that I'm interested in is this shifting policy landscape from the late 1980s with this residualised model and influenced by neoliberal reforms. But also this sort of, so that, in this period leading up to it, we only had one multi-unit complex demolished after the 1980s, which was the Melba Flat. And they called it quite a complex issue, and it was most of their sort of narratives. And this is how, as a sociologist, this is my reminder of, these narratives around social housing was the idea that this was a crime and a ghetto, etc. And that's why it was demolished. And then we had one suburb that was an experiment in social housing, which was a whole suburb of social housing. But it was actually within a good area, and the school was a good school. So you didn't seem to see the issues that arose in that sort of co-location of social housing. But in the 21st century, there was this shift with property prices led to the reduction of public housing availability, and that pushing of moderate income houses into private market, and low-income families faced increasing exclusion from both ownership and residualised public housing. So in Australia at the moment, we've got a real problem with some families are sort of sleeping out of cars or living out of hotels. So the government's paying for them to sleep in a hotel for the night on a regular, sort of in a hotel room or in tents and things like that. And in Canberra, which is very similar to the weather in London, but we don't quite get snow, this is quite a problem in terms of, housing. So in the last 10 years, we've seen more of the spatial inequalities emerging in housing. So inner city estates being redeveloped, as I said, tenant displacement, and then that sort of loss of access to essential services and the exacerbating of those spatial inequalities in housing, homelessness and housing insecurity. So I was thinking about the consequences of residualisation. I've already touched on all of these, but that's just a summary of it. But I think that declining sense of security and belonging compared to early universal provisions was something that really sort of made me think about what was happening here. And these complexities of social housing policy was also, and the implications of this shift as well, was what sort of kept me on this sort of trajectory. So, I mean, I looked at London and the market pragmatism and the residualist dispersal. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that because you all know what's happening in London. But I did see that there was the failures, the parallels between the Canberra experience, even if the scale and the financial pressures were greater here. I could see a lot of the parallels here too. I looked at Loretta Lee's work when she talks about council estates as sinks and poverty. And really that narrative did not apply in the Canberra context. As I said, it was more about this rundown housing stock and the cost, too costly to repair. But I do think that in terms of the housing literature, Lee's connects how the housing trends to broader neoliberal governance is really applies to Canberra with the sell-off of inner city housing stock. And it's generated millions of dollars for the ACT government as a result. And so I do have all those figures, but I'm not giving those to you here today. But I have looked at what the numbers are of decreasing numbers of public housing in inner city to outer city, and what the increasing money that's spent compared to the amount of money that government's made out of that. So it's been an asset selling off and generating income for the government. And so, there are comparisons in terms of the housing stock, etc., between London and Canberra. I looked at Paris's anti-communitarian approach, and I sort of was interested in the Solidarity and Urban Renewal Act of 2000 and its urban renewal programs, ANRU, and the social mixing by redistributing social housing and dispersing immigrant and working class households. And I realised that as I dig deeper and talked to people when I was in Paris, that this Republican universalism was a big problem. So I didn't want to use the Paris model because it's the idea of the individual and the state without the community in between. For me, it was really about the idea of what community plays a very important function, particularly in Aboriginal social housing. So and that idea that the state just privileges the atomised applicant, and sort of that it sort of has a little bit of a neoliberal underpinning to it as well. So and then that idea of you're trying to disperse people, any collective community gathering. So it aims to prevent enclaves, ensure distribution of poorer houses, and create surface level diversity. For me, it serves as a cautionary tale. It's highlighting the risks of anti-communitarian strategies and the importance of maintaining community ties to ensure social cohesion and an effective support system. Vienna, because it resonates in terms of what Canberra used to be. But I know we can't get there because it's a very costly system. But it's like, well, what can we bring back, or what can we do to improve the situation? Why have we gone so far down the other end of the continuum? So it provides an important contrast. The state exercises influence over populations not to fragment, to foster inclusion, stability and cohesion. I think there's a lot that could be learned from that about, in terms of Canberra, that mixed income estates, preserving community ties and supporting solidaristic networks are really important to the Canberra case, especially for Aboriginal people and other populations. They've avoided residualisation, allocations broad and social housing is normalised, minimising stigmatisation and racial inequality. I like the universalist approach. I like the integration and community elements of it. I like the political and social stability of it, the long-term affordability, stigma reduction, and the equity cohesion elements of it as well. There are ongoing challenges I see, including balancing social mix and targeting without excluding resident need. I think that's one of the big issues that Vienna's got around residents in need. Despite its strength, pressures such as gradual deregulation of private rentals and emerging socio-spatial clustering, which threaten inclusivity, and the ongoing market-driven shifts are risk undermining this as well. But it sort of, I guess, it prevents that stigmatisation and segregation that I think is really important for as a case comparison. So across these cases, I can see that residualisation emerges for me. So I'm not as both a neoliberal and a deeply state-mediated phenomenon. It's not driven by market rationales or fiscal austerity, but also by enduring practices of spatial control, such as in Paris, population management, and normative ordering of social life. And it shows that social housing policy is inseparable from the state's role in shaping urban social structures. So for me, it's really about, trying to think about from a social policy perspective and from a comparative social policy perspective, and thinking about Indigenous disadvantage, is this idea of joined up social policy. So in terms of Indigenous social policy, in terms of housing is all about overcoming Indigenous overcrowding, and it's sort of like a case study like this goes to the point of what is the relationship between elements of policy. So you cannot look at housing without thinking about urban structures. You cannot think about housing without thinking about education, resources, services, etc. So the point is to speak back to the Indigenous policy approach. sector-based, sort of that neoliberal sectorisation of social policy in Australia. So that would be, sorry, I've tried to cram so much into a very short presentation.